the best welcome to any speech I've ever given. It's a real pleasure to be here today. When I spoke with David early on when he was planning the summit, I was like, okay, I'm going to India, then New York, but I can definitely be in San Francisco on the 6th of February. So I've kind of come the long way around from Australia, but I'm just so happy to be here because, as David said, community has been absolutely critical to the growth of what we call the collaborative consumption movement over the last 4 or so years. And I wanted to explore some of the themes and the kind of principles that these companies have built themselves on, which have actually created more of a guidebook for other companies to follow. And this, of course, is because of this really interesting position that they're in where their customers are actually their product. These two-sided marketplaces can't actually live without the customers to actually be able to offer those services. And there's a lot of things that the collaborative consumption companies have actually learned along the way that has made this a really seamless transition and the transition to a new kind of economy. So no story about collaborative consumption is complete without a reference to Airbnb, though I'm gathering that in this room they don't need any introduction. They're obviously the global peer-to-peer accommodation marketplace that was founded here in San Francisco in 2007. And of course, by now they've had millions of users all around the world in pretty much every country. They've topped more than 10 million nights booked. But what I wanted to refer to Airbnb for was, in their early days, they really encapsulated what I think is the core of the collaborative consumption movement and the communities that follow. So of course, they have now hit 10 million nights booked, but it actually took them more than 4 years to actually achieve their very first million nights. And of course, most of their growth has been in the last few years. So what was it that actually took so long for them to actually gain these first million nights booked? And what were those things that they did that actually helped galvanize the company to be what it is today? Well, back when they had the idea, Brian, Nate, and Joe tried all kinds of different ideas and gimmicks to actually get the buzz about Airbnb out, whether that was aligning with South by Southwest to attract that early adopter tech crowd, or selling novelty cereals, Captain McCain's and Obama O's at the Democratic and Republican national conventions. Even cereal didn't get them across the line. But it was one of the pieces of advice they got when they were participating in the Y Combinator program from Paul Graham, one of their mentors, that really did make the difference and catapult them into this next phase. And Paul's advice was, do the things that don't scale. Go out and meet your users, your hosts and your guests, and understand what it is that brings them to this platform that is so unique and so revolutionary. So Brian got on a plane and went to visit hosts in cities all around the US so he could both observe what they were doing with the platform, listen to any feedback that they had, and actually adapt the platform to be more suitable for them. And this really has galvanized what has now become Airbnb, because his critical realization in that time was, it's not about marketplaces or exchanges of accommodation. It is actually about the community that has been created of hosts and guests all around the world. And this is underpinning what we call the collaborative consumption movement, where consumers, consume one-way transactions, but now we're in a phase of the economy where members are looking for two-way relationships. So I've been working with the author Rachel Botsman for the last 4 years, who wrote the book What's Mine Is Yours: The Rise of Collaborative Consumption. And we define this movement as the reinvention of what are really old market behaviours, such as bartering, swapping, lending, renting, and sharing. But what's changed this time and brought them into the Facebook age is their reliance on technology to allow them to scale in ways and on a scale that's never literally been possible before this time. It's now spawned a much bigger new economy that's emerging off the back of some of these startups. We've had millions of venture investment into the space, not just here in San Francisco, but all around the world. We've had cities declaring themselves sharing cities, with 15 US mayors signing the Shareable Cities Resolution in mid-last year. We've had events and conferences, we've had thousands of startups emerge around the world, big brands starting to wonder what this is all about and how they can be involved. And of course, local community groups who aren't just interested in one particular company, but who are interested in the movement as a whole and coming together to celebrate these new trends. That's everything from We Share in Europe and come out of Paris, to Let's Collaborate in New York, to some of the activities down at home in Australia as well. There are thousands of examples that have emerged from all sorts of verticals, from bike sharing to car sharing, ride sharing, peer-to-peer accommodation, skill sharing, the latest buzz craze, pet sharing, through the likes of Dog Vacay, if you can't commit to a pet, but you can borrow your neighbours. And of course has attracted the attention of heavyweights from Ron Conway to Steve Case to Time magazine. And in fact, last year was really the year of the cover story for collaborative consumption in the sharing economy, with The Economist and Forbes also doing a cover story on Airbnb. So collaborative consumption is one part of what we see as a bigger shift towards a collaborative economy. But within collaborative consumption, we obviously have business-to-business models, business-to-consumer models, and probably most importantly, or most revolutionarily, peer-to-peer models, which are these two-sided marketplaces that bring together hosts and guests, drivers and passengers, task rabbits, and people who need stuff done. So I'm going to focus on the peer-to-peer side of things today because I think that's where the most interesting work has been done on community and why it's most critical for these kinds of companies to scale. Because community really is at the epicenter of the collaborative economy, and we're just going to start to see more and more of these kinds of models emerging. So the first key principle that really defines collaborative consumption companies or keeps them together is this idea of the underlying values that are involved. This isn't just paying for a service and getting something that you need. This is about buying into the values of the collaborative consumption movement. And these values are things like collaboration, of course, empowerment, empowering individuals to use their skills, use their time, use their stuff, and openness between the platform and the community itself. And perhaps most critically, the humanness that comes with these real stories of individuals who are participating in this movement, not just anonymous brands and kind of faceless transactions. So the best kinds of companies are the ones that are actually leveraging these values to build their own communities. Platforms like Mama Bake, which is a batch cooking platform in Australia where parents come together to batch cook things like stews, soups, curries, pasta sauces, and then divvy them up amongst that community so that they've got a week's worth of fantastic meals for their family. This is the Mama Bake community in Eltham Wattletree in Victoria, and they basically come together week on week to actually make nutritious food for their family, but also have this much more social experience of what it's like to provide for the family. And now when Michelle Shearer, who founded Mama Bake, actually set about to create this community, she realized that what brought people to this community were these values of nutrition and all kinds of food values around what people wanted to eat, but also the value of coming together and preparing meals, such a social and connected experience with others. So she created the Mama Bake Mama Festo, and that's actually been the guiding principles as the community has grown all around Australia and even internationally, with a 90% increase in transactions in the last 12 months. And so this is because this community is actually organised around these values, which has allowed them to scale and be so globally dispersed with still retaining this central principle. Carpooling.com is a pan-European ride-sharing network that actually offers end-to-end trips, but also fills in the gaps between, you're catching a flight here and then you need to be taken to the train station. So carpooling.com can actually fill in these gaps. Now, carpooling is also oriented around values, but in fact has a really different set of values that their community brings to it. And in fact, it's the diversity of those values that actually is so interesting. They have a very mixed demographic of people across all ages, using the platform for all sorts of reasons as well. There's a great story that the community manager here in the US told me, where there was this elderly couple, an 80-year-old couple who'd been visiting their daughter in a German town and needed to travel back home about 300 miles. And the daughter arranged for them to take this carpooling experience. Now, they, of course, couldn't quite get their head around this kind of carpooling thing, and they thought this guy was a taxi driver the whole way. They were chatting for 5 hours, and at the end, they demanded that they pay him twice as much because they just couldn't understand why it was so cheap. But you're dealing with this huge spectrum of values, and if it is to go mainstream, it's about understanding how to work within each of those different segments. So strong communities are built around these clear values. So how does your company actually define its values and attract a community that identifies strongly with it and is actually that organising principle around which the community is built? So the second key pillar of collaborative consumption companies, and one that companies like Lyft have actually done extremely well, is this idea of building trust between strangers. How do we suddenly feel comfortable getting into the front seat of a stranger's car, whereas, catching a taxi in a regulated system actually feels more strange? Another company that's done this really well here in San Francisco is TaskRabbit. Of course, you would know TaskRabbit enables people to list tasks that they need doing, and they get done by people who have the time or the skills to actually do those tasks. So when Leah Buskey actually came up with this idea for TaskRabbit, she had hit on this principle that she called service networking, where we were shifting our online networks to actually get things done in the real world. But in order to do this, we needed to build trust first online, and that could bring people offline to meet in the real world. So the core elements of trust that companies like Airbnb, TaskRabbit, Lyft are actually building their systems on include things like verification. Are you who you say you are? Who are you connected with? Which is why things like Facebook Connect have been such a strong login system for a lot of these startups. What are the interests and values that these people share on both sides of the spectrum, and how can we actually match people according to those things? And of course, there's the ratings and reviews systems, which allow people to build a bit of a profile and a personality on each of those platforms. And to reiterate a point that Emily said before, I think it's something about these profiles, these reputations that they're building, which actually enable the respect of TaskRabbits like Chris Mock, where ordinarily it might be a status change to have somebody to come and assemble your IKEA furniture for you. Well, now there's a respect and a kind of an authority that comes with being this trusted TaskRabbit within this community. And it's these kind of trust systems that actually enable the most interesting transactions to take place, such as this elderly mother who lives here in San Francisco. She was one of the first women who posted when TaskRabbit launched in San Francisco, because her 20-year-old son was in Boston undergoing chemotherapy, and she couldn't, on her librarian's salary, visit regularly enough to take care of him. So she enlisted the help of this young mum in Boston to go and visit her son for 30 minutes every day, take him some treats and give her a call to update on his progress. And this kind of trusted bond that developed between these two women, these two strangers, wouldn't have been possible without that platform that TaskRabbit provided. Now, one company who's had a kind of slightly opposite experience to this of late, that did have this amazing trusted community of millions of members, is Couchsurfing. But of course, Couchsurfing actually recently changed their business structure. They became a for-profit company and a certified B Corp, and took on a lot of venture investment to the tune of $15 million. But what actually started to happen was, once that pressure of a different kind of structure came into play, a lot of their existing community members were actually really put offside by these changes and didn't feel included in the process. So one community member blogged, this was largely a volunteer-based organisation previously. Now people will be making a profit off all of this work that we've actually put into it beforehand. There's betrayal about the shift to this model when the principles were so clearly anti-monetary exchange. A lot of members were concerned because the company hadn't kind of made a decision to be honest or transparent about what they were actually planning to do. And of course, then there's the tension between the existing users with their strong values and the new user base that needs to be attracted at all costs to be able to meet the revenue targets that now exist. So what happened here was that Couchsurfing literally took for granted the community values that it had been built upon, and they lacked the transparency to actually deal with their members in an appropriate way and bring them along for that journey. So the community not only needs to trust each other in these situations, but they need to actually trust the organisation that's providing the service. So how can we remain transparent and accountable to the community despite the pressures of business? Because of course there are going to be times where we need to make trade-offs. So one company that has actually had to make one of these trade-offs and has pivoted their model slightly is Skillshare, a New York-based skill-sharing platform founded by Mike Kanjanaprakorn. Now, when Skillshare launched, Mike had this vision to create a community marketplace where anyone could learn anything from anyone else, a real peer-to-peer education community. And they launched by offering offline classes where people would come together and learn in a real environment. But of course, while this was really successful in those early days, there came a point where they realized this model wouldn't scale to the effect that they needed to if they were going to be, this global company that they ideally wanted to be. So they made the decision to shift to an online-only model. And Danya Cheskaskol, their community manager, original community manager, really remembers this well because she had to get on the phone with 100 of their master teachers, their most valued resources, and actually explain to them the model changes and work with them to see if they could make this new platform work for them, because they really were the most valuable asset that Skillshare had at that time. Now, while not everybody would have been on board with those changes, it wasn't necessarily about changing the business decision, but at least making those people feel like they'd been consulted through that process. So communication is really key to keeping the community empowered and for them to remember that they are the reason you exist, not the other way around. Etsy is another fantastic company, also New York based, that has done a phenomenal job with empowering and involving their community through different mechanisms, whether it's their town hall meetings, where they bring together their sellers and their community to discuss potential changes that are happening to the platform, keep them involved on the vision for the future. And the other thing that's great about Etsy is the way they've created a platform for their sellers to actually self-organize, similar to what the Lyft drivers are doing. You know, there's no top-down emphasis. It's actually what the sellers feel is most appropriate. So there's a team in New York called Etsy New York, and their whole mission, they're actually a non-profit organization with a mission for education and empowerment around this new makerspace. So they run events to educate people about Etsy and also about how to make things. And they also did a season on Governor's Island in a little cottage over the summer of 2012, where they actually set up shop and sold Etsy wares and actually ran classes at the same time. So you can see this has nothing to do with what Etsy has told them to do, but that they feel compelled to evangelize on Etsy's behalf because of what that platform provides to them. And as the CEO of Etsy said, I think of our community as being like a circle, and Etsy is inside that circle. The community surrounds Etsy, and Etsy is the platform that serves this community. So when the community is central to your business and keeping them empowered and involved is critical, how do you create choices and pathways for the community to both interact with you as well as other community members and to maintain that high engagement that comes with being empowered and involved? Now, I have just very few minutes left, but I wanted to share big picture what this has actually meant for us at Collaborative Lab and how we've actually realized we needed to observe these lessons of community from the companies in the collaborative consumption space to actually be able to grow our own community stronger. So this was the original collaborativeconsumption.com website, which was launched 4 years ago to help people understand what this movement was all about. You know, a definition, highlighting the companies that made this movement tick. But over the last probably 3 years or so, we've realized that there are now hundreds of people around the world who are community leaders in their own right, driving this collaborative consumption movement forward. And they were all part of our network, but what we were doing with collaborativeconsumption.com didn't really give them any empowerment or involvement. You know, the values were there, but we weren't really including them in that process. So we consulted with about 15 of who we considered to be the leading community members in collaborative consumption globally about 2 years ago. And we discussed with them what they might like to see, how we could actually help them to spread the word of collaborative consumption further in their own communities, whilst also building their own reputation and profile as a collaborative consumption leader. So we relaunched collaborativeconsumption.com about a year ago, almost a year ago now. And we brought on these 15 people that we mentioned to become our first global curators. People who actually had access to the back end of the website and were responsible for sharing stories of what was happening locally. They could profile local entrepreneurs, but also just generally profile themselves as leaders within that community. And in this last year that's passed, we've actually more than doubled the number of global curators that we have on our team, from destinations as far as Lithuania and Singapore, India, Brazil, back in Australia, obviously, and other parts of Europe, as well as Argentina, Canada, and the US. So we're really giving this global perspective on what collaborative consumption is, but more to the point, we're empowering a whole generation of collaborative consumption community members to stake their claim on this space and actually help to grow the movement in their own territory as well. And that's been fundamentally a huge shift for us and something that we feel really excited about being able to do. So to wrap up, there are 3 key themes that I think are very consistent across all collaborative consumption communities. This idea of being organized around strong values, having trust and transparency at the core of what you do, and empowering and involving your community. And I think this is relevant beyond the collaborative consumption community because we're actually entering into a new phase of business where every business is going to need to be looking to the community to actually build a strong presence and be successful. We're moving away from this centralized power model to a more distributed model in all industries where community is absolutely going to be at the heart of it. So congratulations to you all for being at the vanguard, and I believe the future is all about community. So thank you very much.